Welcome to Theory Underground. We're back. Chris Cutrone, how are you doing?
Good. Good. How's it going, Dave?
Now that I ate, I had a good lunch. I'm doing great. How about you?
Good. Summer
Yeah.
break.
Summer break time. Nice. Well, I wanted to bring you back because I've been away doing the European tour and have just been busy, busy, busy since we last saw one another. And last time you were here, it was for the contradiction with Todd McGowan. And your book since then has been published. Is that right?
Yes. So there's a second volume now from Sublation called Marxism and Politics. So it's the follow-up to the Death of the Millennial Left from last year. And it's a monster. So the two books are really kind of one book. So the
Okay.
first book was like 200 something pages. This is 700 something pages. So it's basically 1,000 pages in two volumes. And the second book is the theoretical writings.
And what's it called
So
again?
Marxism and Politics.
Marxism and Politics. Amazing.
Yep. Essays on critical theory and the party.
So, what does that mean to say that this is the theoretical one?
Well, so the first book was more about it collected my writings on like current political events during the time of the millennial left, over the course of the past 18 years. And this second book is collecting my writings that were more on history and theory. So history of Marxism and sort of basic theoretical concepts in Marxism. And so that the first book was more political. This is a little bit more intellectual, we might
Okay.
say.
Okay. So, might be of interest to people at Theory Underground, in other words.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that in many respects, the second book is the more important book to my mind. But you know, I think the first book, the political writings coming out initially, I think I wrote there in the preface that I was concerned that people would think that my theory is motivated by my politics, whereas really my politics is motivated by my theory.
Okay.
Um, which is that goes against the grain of assumptions on the Marxist left because they think that you have a political commitment based on your social being, and then it's like standpoint epistemology. Then your epistemology, your theory comes from that position, right?
Right.
That social position you're in and the politics of that social position. So, especially in terms of like, me as like a white man, it's like I have to sort of, I don't know, occupy a political position, a white American man, a political position contrary to my social position, right? Or something like that. That's my
Like
moral
that.
obligation,
That's the
you
idea,
know,
right? Okay.
right? That I'm supposed to be the self-denying ally of whomever,
Right. Right.
right? And that's supposed to be informing my theory, and no, I mean, I used to be just a conventional leftist when I was much younger, where probably my political orientation did like affect my theoretical view, but that's been a long time and I've reconsidered things a great deal and I've sort of reconstructed things, put the pieces back together for myself. And so now I can confidently say that my view of politics is informed by my theory.
So, this standpoint epistemology, this idea that you're, oh well, as a white man, there's a system of privileges, and there's a party that you're basically inclined to join out of your self interest, and that would be the Republicans. But if you want to
Oh
be one of
man.
but if you want to be one of the good ones, then you're going to have to self deny a little bit and be a Democrat, and probably try really hard to be an ally, right? Like that's what you're getting at. And you're saying
Yes, that
that in the 70s that might have been true for you as a young gay male who's white in the United
well, I was too
States.
young then in the 80s.
Oh,
In
in
the
the
80s.
80s. Okay.
Like yes, so as a young like gay kid, I guess I was predisposed to being anti-Republican Party and treating the Democrats like they were untrustworthy advocates or untrustworthy allies. Like, so I would have been suspicious of the Democrats for, like, you know, betraying me, but I would have seen the Republicans as representing something opposed to me, right? In the Reagan era, basically. That's when
Mm.
I was an adolescent, in the Reagan era. And so that would have been a natural inclination. They were the ruling party in some respects. Actually, the Democrats still controlled Congress, so everything was bipartisan. All the
Mm.
conservatism was bipartisan at that time, as it is still now in its own way. People don't pay attention to that part of it. So, yeah, but I think that generally people are looking for your political bona fides before they take your ideas seriously. And I think that really people should take ideas seriously and then think about the political implications of those ideas rather than starting with figuring out someone's politics, by which they just mean their kind of opinion,
Yeah.
or maybe their taste,
Right.
their cultural taste,
Hmm.
their cultural affinity. That's what people usually think is politics.
Right.
And so of course I'm here to challenge all that, right? Because I don't think that we really have politics now. We have taste communities, we have affinity groups, and we have culture wars, and we have political parties that demagogue and play on our personal anxieties,
Right. Right.
and so to me, we live in a very apolitical or anti-political or something realm, even though everything's hyper politicized. I actually think that that's like contrary to what I would consider to be politics, which would be, organizing, you know, the majority of people to change society.
Organizing with people whose tastes might be different than yours.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And people having to transcend their personal cultural affinities and their opinions in order to get a collective project accomplished.
Yeah, it does come across like I've been trying to find a way to formulate this, but it does feel like politics is, on the one side it's this opinion thing. It's supposed to tell us if a person's good or bad or if they're thoughtful, but also what it divulges into is fantasy football, right? Like it
Oh yeah.
just right, like they're kind of
Oh yeah.
saying well, if I was the Machiavellian prince, here's who I'd put where. And it's like, I don't care, man. I don't care who you would put where. You're a good person, I trust you,
They put Chris Cutrone in the theory, like armchair, like the fantasy football league. Like some people would maybe put me in, like, safely sequestered in the theoretical armchair to be referred to only occasionally
Yeah.
or something, you know. Like, yeah, we should have leftist trading cards, shouldn't we?
Yeah, I think that'd be fun, right?
It
Someone should
should be
get
like
on that.
Magic the Gathering, except leftism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so I've got a few different questions I want to get to. I want to talk a little bit about Trump. I want to talk a little bit about Biden. I want to talk a little bit about Marx versus Marxism. I want to talk a little bit about Palestine, Gaza, etc. You've taken heat recently for a variety of positions, especially on Palestine, genocide, slavery, etc. There's probably other things that I just haven't looked into because I've been so busy, but like I'm aware of that one. I looked a little into
Uh-huh.
it.
Yeah.
And I was telling Anne about it on the way here, and she thought it was very interesting. She hadn't really thought about that position before. But before we get to that, I want to
Uh-huh.
talk briefly about the fact that you are teaching Introduction to Marxism this
Yes.
fall in October at Theory
Yes.
Underground. Yeah, and
Yes.
maybe could you just say a couple of things about what you aim to do and what you think people in the underground theory scene need to know about Marx and that what we'll be getting into.
Okay, so, you and I have conferred on this, and came up with some primary texts, by historical Marxists, in order to try to get across some key ideas. Um, and, also maybe looking at things that are well known, but maybe not the things that people turn to immediately to read when they think of reading Marx or Lenin, or Lukács or the Frankfurt School, So it's like that's the mission The mission is basic concepts and getting them from the primary texts.
Mm-hmm. But it's
Right?
not like, but we're not going to be doing, say, the Communist Manifesto. That's not.
Right.
So we're
Right.
not going
So
to the main ones that people have habitually gone
normally
to.
do.
Yeah.
Yes. Still well-known works, but maybe the works that are slightly offbeat, like 18th Brumaire by Marx,
Mm.
the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, in order to get like Marx's view on politics, essentially, which you don't really get in the manifesto,
Mm.
ironically enough. So people think that the manifesto is giving you Marxist politics. It really isn't, um, because it's giving more of like a historical overview of things, and view of like capitalism and communism. But it's not terribly political. And also, he changed his mind around the experience of the revolutions of 1848.
Mm.
So it was one of the few times in his life where he really modified his position, and it was based on his actual experience, going through those revolutions. And so you get the mature political perspective of Marx only after 1848, whereas the manifesto is from before 1848. It's anticipating the revolution, but the 18th Brumaire is really about a kind of taking stock of what has happened after the
Mm.
revolution.
Mm.
The result of the revolution is.
And for a person who's not a Marxist, who's never really been attracted to Marxism, this course might have a particular value. For a person who was a Marxist but isn't anymore, this course might have a particular value. But also for a person who considers themselves a Marxist, it also might have a value to them. Would you say it's the same value, or is there kind of like something different to be gotten from these three different positions?
I mean, there would be perhaps something different, but all of them would have in common a kind of unfamiliar Marx, or the Marx that's not usually emphasized, or the Marx that tends to be downplayed or has become forgotten, or maybe it's there but it's a little obscure,
Mm.
right? And so for people who are already familiar with Marxism, whether they are ex-Marxist, post-Marxist, or still consider themselves to be Marxist, of course I'm going to be trying to get them to rethink, reconsider, see things in a different way, see things in a different angle. um I think that in the forward of my book Marxism and Politics, I talk about this, about like what you focus on, what's foreground, what's background.
Hmm.
And I use the metaphor of when you're reading Marx, especially, but when you're reading any of these historical texts, your eyes might glaze over some passages because you're not really following. You don't really know what they're talking about. So there are some things that it seems clear what they're talking about, but then there are other things that's like, I don't know what they're talking about. And in fact, it turns out those, because this is my experience learning about Marxism, those things that your eyes glaze over are actually the important parts. Those are the key parts, right?
Right.
And so, it's the most important stuff in Marxism is actually the most obscure and forgotten and difficult stuff at this point for us to understand. And it has to do with things that they took for granted, assumptions that they had that we just don't share,
Mm.
because we're not living in the same world, not only in terms of the historical world, but the political world. So Marx was writing as and for other socialists and communists of his time who were sharing a historical experience, to be sure, but were also sharing some basic assumptions, some basic concepts, some basic orientations that
Mm.
we no longer share.
Hmm.
We translate them into different terms. We have a different worldview fundamentally, than they did. A lot of debates in Marxism are like that too. That where, as much as there were important differences, still their underlying assumptions, they agreed with each other more than we agree with them, is the way that I like to put it.
So you'll be going into a lot of that, and does that throw a wrench in traditional Marxism, or if a person is a Marxist, is it going to complicate their Marxism for them?
Hopefully so. Hopefully it will at least enrich, you know, It should complicate things. It should, again, make them rethink, reconsider. I mean, I should also just say, this is no secret. One of my goals with respect to people, I am interested in getting people not interested in Marxism, whether through lack of familiarity or through familiarity and rejection, to reconsider and to become interested.
Hmm.
For for however, for many people who are already interested in Marxism and think of themselves as Marxists, part of my mission is to convince them that they're not actually Marxists and that
Right.
they should give it up.
They should give it up.
Yeah, they should give it up, because they really want to do something else. And that's something that we'll talk about when it comes to, the things I've written about this year, like Trump and Israel-Palestine. I don't know if we'll touch on the third article that I've written this year is on Milton Friedman, basically on post-neoliberalism, neoliberalism, that kind of thing. And so again, it's like, actually, you don't want to be a Marxist. You want to be a third world nationalist, or you want to be, a Democrat, basically, or you want to be a Keynesian
Right.
economics person, right? And so none of that has anything to do with Marxism, actually. Nothing. Like, and Marxism is opposed to all of that, right?
So
So,
why would a person who calls themselves Marxist in reality want to be a democratic Keynesian or a third world nationalist?
oh, because they reach to Marxism to justify something that's not Marxist. So they use Marxism because Marxism has a kind of an intellectual kind of authority, if you will, or kind of a reputation or a kind of elan. It has a kind of a um, prestige, we might even say. Especially Marx himself has a prestige that I think is confused. Meaning, and this is rather recent. So in my lifetime, people used to be much more aware that Marx is a very particular thinker who, I think that in my time, like when I was in college, the professors, the academics were interested in saying how Marx was wrong.
Hmm.
And whereas now it's about bending Marx to say what we want him to say.
Hmm.
And then subsequent Marxists too. So there's a lot of like Marxist Leninism now in the air. And so people also do this to Lenin. They make him say what they want him to say rather than what he actually said. And so that's the point, to recognize the contradiction or the disparity there.
Well, so that might be a good segue maybe into the Friedman piece, but also into the other two pieces. And so, I mean, let's just as a sort of case study or example use
Yeah.
this third world nationalism example. So you're saying there are people, they consider themselves some kind of Marxist Leninist. That Marxist Leninism leads them to the conclusion that the thing that they should be doing right now is advocating for this kind of third world nationalism. Um, what are some? So, I mean, who do you think of when you think of that? Are you thinking of like Haas? Who else are you thinking of?
Oh, sure. There's the MAGA communists, but also
Bad empanada.
yeah, sure.
What about
Right.
Hakeem? Are you talking about Hakeem?
Him I may not know.
Okay. What about One Dime? Do you know One Dime?
One time, of course. Yeah, yeah.
So
Tony.
would Tony be one of those third world nationalist
Maybe,
types?
maybe not. I was thinking, of course, of this, like, there's a guy running around who's closer to my age, Gabriel Rockhill, who's very anti-Frankfurt School,
Right, right, right.
who's associated with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And they are kind of post-Trotskyist neo-Stalinists. I don't know what you call them.
Hmm.
They're Stalinisty. And you know, generally speaking, but I would say generally Stalinism and Maoism are having a heyday now. In the post-DSA moment, right? So
Okay.
that it comes out of disenchantment with the DSA, disenchantment with social imperialists, social patriots, like the DSA, the Social Democrats. Um, and you know, the Israel-Palestine issue is just one thing that is expressive of this.
Okay.
But I would say, generally speaking, there is this idea of like Bernie and the DSA and Jacobin are like the social democrat, social patriotic, social imperialist bad people on the left, right? And I think that maybe one of the things now, like, Carlos Garrido, like Midwestern Marx, like, like Western Marx,
I was gonna bring that up. I haven't
yeah,
looked too much into it, but I understand that they are
Western Marx.
Midwestern Marxist Institute or whatever is like they like to bring on Rockhill a lot. People are always telling me I should look into them, but I haven't yet. So, um,
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's like just something in the air last year and this year, towards the end of last year, like again, like clearly exemplified by the pro-Palestinian sentiments.
for sure.
But also, I would say the last few years, like post 2020, it's been sort of emerging a kind of neo-Stalinist kind of framework. Also multipolarity, geopolitics,
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
kind of idea.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I'm skeptical of that we are moving into a multipolar world actually. Like the thing is, so I'll just say, Dave, like I'm old enough now. I've lived through things several times over. I've heard this before. I've heard it all before. That's the problem. I've actually heard it all before. I've heard the end of US global domination,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
multipolarity.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I've heard
Yeah.
it many times throughout my
Yeah.
life. And people talked about Vietnam
Yep.
leading to that,
Yep.
right? And
Well,
that was even in the Cold War context. They were still thinking that actually the Vietnam War was the decline of the US and Germany and Japan are going to rise, right? So it wasn't even within the Cold War framework. I think that now that aspect of a post-Cold War framework is coming to the fore, but they don't understand that people also said this during the Cold War. They also said it in the 80s, like in the Reagan era. So they said it in the high Cold War of the 60s. They also said it in the kind of different period of the 70s, but also in the renewed Cold War of the 80s, that the capitalist world was fragmenting, that the decline of the US would mean the rise of other powers in the capitalist world.
right.
BRICS is really what people talk about with respect to that. The problem there being, well, what is the difference between Russia and China, right? So, like Brazil and Russia and India are clearly capitalist, but what is China? And so there's also mixed in with this multipolarity some idea that somehow the Chinese capitalist road to socialism is going to lead the world to socialism,
Right. Right.
right? A lot of China, uh, I don't know, sentiment, pro-China sentiment.
And you're not convinced that is getting at anything real.
I mean, of course, it's referring to something real. I just don't think that there's a science fiction book on the shelf behind me, China Mountain Zhang, right? Like some dystopian world in which communist China takes over, but it's still a capitalist world. I don't think that that's actually going to happen. I think it's science fiction, it's dystopian science fiction. It always has been and always will be.
Okay,
And the
but
left, of course, shamelessly engages in dystopian science fiction. It does.
and
Right.
so does the
The
neo-reactionary
right.
right, right? And
The right does
so
too, yeah.
Nick Land's been convinced that the Looper thesis was correct, and that is that Shanghai is where it's at, right? That'll be the first, the first place where the singularity is birthed, and that's why he moved there supposedly. But the reason that there's something interesting in that thesis is that he thinks that the neoliberalization is getting in the like, which is to say, like the get out of the way of the markets and also disempower the state. That those kinds of moves result in the efficiency of technological development being thwarted somewhat, right? Whereas like China is able to put all of its resources towards different things that the U.S. kind of can't. Its hands are kind of tied because of its, the big money interests that ultimately rule. So what
Yeah.
do you think about that? position
This is
that,
the discontent with neoliberalism. So the problem with people my age and people younger than me is that we think neoliberalism is capitalism,
yeah,
and we forget that there used to be another kind of capitalism, in the Fordist era.
right,
And so, we have a skewed view of capitalism. That means that if somehow the neoliberal order collapses, then that means the end of capitalism. It doesn't.
right,
It
right,
does not. Right?
right.
So, it's something that I write about when I write about like Moishe Postone. He has a way of thinking about this that I also think was symptomatic, not exactly correct, which is that maybe the world will oscillate between statist and more market-oriented forms of capitalism. And it might appear that way, but I think that David Harvey was a little bit better on this in the sense of accumulation of things, meaning that the original kind of liberal, more laissez-faire capitalism of the late 19th and early 20th century didn't go away, but it was subsumed under the Fordist form of more state-managed capitalism, and that also didn't go away in neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is also it's neoliberal, it's also state managed. It's also a statist form of capitalism. And so post neoliberalism, this was my point in writing my review of Jennifer Burns's book, her biography of Milton Friedman.
Hmm.
So I wrote an article called "We Are All Friedmanites Now,"
Mm.
um, because Joe Biden famously during the 2020 campaign said Milton Friedman's not running the show anymore.
Okay.
And the question is, was he ever running the show? Maybe not. And
Hmm.
so maybe neoliberalism wasn't really Friedmanite any more than Fordism was really Keynesian, like didn't really fulfill the ideas of these intellectuals, but those ideas were just used to justify some capitalist policies. They were kind of window dressing on those
Hmm.
policies, and that there's a great deal more continuity than change in these like seeming ideological revolutions. And that after neoliberalism it will be post neoliberal, and maybe this is something that Jennifer Burns picked up on in her book, that maybe the future belongs to Friedman after all, meaning that not just because neoliberalism continues, but because the neglected sides of Friedman's thought are now pressing themselves to the foreground. Because of course Friedman was thinking of things in the Fordist era, and Friedman, like everyone else, was assuming that things would just continue. So he formulated his ideas in the 50s and 60s, and he thought that capitalism would just continue in that way. And his ideas only gained currency when there was a crisis and when there was a downturn. And his ideas were not based on downturn, they were based on growth. So
Hmm.
he wanted to make the most of like a steady growth curve. He wasn't thinking of a downturn. And then his ideas gained a currency in a completely different context. Similarly, a lot of anti-neoliberalism has internalized austerity, and the future may not be austerity. I mean, this is maybe the little kernel of truth in the idea that they look at China and they say, okay, this is a different growth model, and it doesn't seem to be as hampered by capitalism as the United States is, right? That it's
Right.
since it's more statist, they're able to engage in economic growth in a way that the United States stagnates. And what they don't pay attention to there is how China is stagnating. In other words, the growth curve of post 1989 China, like the rocket curve of high growth, is not really sustainable. And China also experienced a crisis after 2008 and has also experienced a crisis after COVID, right? So I would say that that's where we can't imagine that Chinese growth is going to lead the world. We also can't imagine that the US growth is just over or something, that it's just all downhill from here.
Right.
So just basic, and when you talk to people about this, they probably do have a more sophisticated understanding than that. However, that's the assumption. Like, in other words, there's like a very deep like set of assumptions that are more the way people feel about things, right? And it affects the way they see things. And I don't think that that's just mistaken. It's coming from historical experience. But my basic thesis is that when we look at contemporary events, we tend to be stuck in the past. We tend
Okay.
to project the past into the future, and capitalism surprises us. That's one of the things that is true. Capitalism surprises us.
Yeah, one of the things that I don't buy into, and I think I might not buy into it just because I kind of grew up around a lot of conservatives who are very doom and gloom, Y2K, we got to prep, kind of end of the world, this, right?
Right.
So now when you get all these people who are trying to bring back concerns about peak oil and of course climate change and everything, it's like, I mean, I get it, is, but also I'm not saying like, oh, technology will save us. I'm just saying I think the problems are probably bigger than that. And also those problems, the ones that are supposed to sign
And
some like
secondary.
the ones
Yeah.
that will bring the actual destruction of it. I just like, well, wouldn't that be convenient? Like Zizek says,
Oh, sure.
he says that's too optimistic. And I think it is kind
Yes.
of too optimistic. It is sort of,
Yes.
yeah. So, bringing it back then to this sort of Rockhill Midwestern Marxist sort of tendency. Look, a lot of people, I imagine, who do watch your stuff and kind of frequent the places that you go online are potentially also watching stuff over there. And
Yeah.
to a lot of people, it's hard to probably tell a difference a lot of the time.
Maybe.
What is it that you're offering in terms of like Marxism that complicates this it's kind of the world against the United States right now
Uh-huh.
model.
Okay, so surely I can make reference to the essay that I published with you in your book Underground Theory on the negative dialectic of Marxism.
Yeah.
Um, and meaning what is the dialectic about? Why is Marx dialectical? It's not about that kind of thing. It's not about like class antagonisms or national antagonisms or racial antagonisms or gender antagonisms or whatever, or trans versus cis antagonisms or queer versus straight antagonisms. It's not. It's about self-contradiction. And it specifically is about the self-contradiction of attempts to change the world in capitalism. So it's about how capitalism moves through self-contradiction, but it also means that our movements to change the world within capitalism also move through self-contradiction.
Okay.
So that's in other words, the object of contradiction for Marx is the working class itself. It's the self-contradictory character of the working class in its own struggle. That's the issue. It's not the workers versus the capitalists. It's
Okay.
not. It's the self-contradiction of the workers in their social struggle in capitalism.
And that
That's the
self
contradiction.
and that self contradiction is what?
Well, that they're both trying to reconstitute labor as value and trying to transcend it at the same time. And those are actually contradictory things. So the working class is trying to put capitalism back together, trying to put bourgeois social relations back together, trying to restore the value of labor, while their struggle also objectively tends to point towards transcending that social relation.
Does any working class organizing really try to transcend that situation? Like who's trying to transcend capitalism? Like I'm outside of like maybe class unity or some group like that. Like who's
Well, objectively, it's subjective and objective. That would be another. There are
okay.
different ways of thinking about it. There's of course, people know the dialectic of theory and practice, but have they really thought what that means? It really means that the theory and the practice contradict each other.
Yeah.
So another way of thinking about it is subject and object. I don't know, I'll use a Lukács phrase that
Sure.
we'll cover in my course,
Okay, wonderful.
right? The proletariat is the subject object of history,
Okay.
right? It's both the object and the subject of
Hmm.
this movement in capitalism. That's what history means. And also any attempt to get beyond capitalism. It's both the object of that process and the subject of that process. So ironically enough, subjectively, the workers are bourgeois, meaning they're trying to restore labor and the social relations of labor and try to reestablish social cooperation. That's what they think. That's what people think socialism and communism are. And of course, that is what they are. It's, for Marx, socialism and communism were a bourgeois ideology
Mm-hmm.
based on, fraternité, liberty, égalité, fraternité, definitely
Mm-hmm.
égalité and fraternité, right? It's social cooperation, cooperative labor, right? Social production. So that is subjectively what the workers' movement is and has always been about. Objectively, however, the result of the realization of the value of labor in capitalism actually both drives on and constrains technical change in production. So objectively, the workers undermine themselves. I mean, it's a very simple way of putting it is when the workers collectively bargain to get the value of their labor from the capitalists, then the capitalists say, oh shit, we should invest in machines.
Right, 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 right.
Right? So automation is actually the result of the workers succeeding in their class struggle, in which they eliminate themselves and become wretched, opioid addict, death of despair people. So that's the result of success. And
Okay.
it's not just because the evil capitalists. It's not because the evil capitalists are just having their money wads and are like, oh, fuck, I don't want to give it to the workers. I'd rather spend it on machines. They don't want to spend it on anything, right? But objectively, societally, it has this effect.
So,
So, in
because I,
fact, the workers have an interest in replacing labor with machines too.
right.
They just don't want to be. They don't want to end up starving as a result. They want to.
Yeah,
They want to end up working fewer hours and having more stuff that machines can produce,
right.
right? But socially, politically, it has the result of creating a surplus population that's screwed over, right?
Okay. This all follows. Now, really quick though, so I just want to check, where does the competition between capitalists that also has them investing in research and development that also, lowers
That's
the
healthy. That's healthy
socialists or whatever.
competition, meaning that's the competition of scientists in a lab, right? Who's going to discover something first? Who's going to, or, I kind of think back to like when I was a kid, children used to do very unsafe activities, go-karts,
Yeah. The most
right?
fun
So
thing,
who's
the
going to make
most fun thing, right?
who's going to make the fastest go-kart? Who's going to like, cook up some new engineering mechanism that makes it go faster in the garage, right? So that's fine. That kind of competition is fine. We're not really talking about that. We're talking about, right?
Yeah.
It's like Wile E. Coyote, super genius, right?
Yeah.
He's going to make the faster rocket pack to catch the Roadrunner, right? That's all wonderful. It's like fucking Jeff Bezos versus Elon Musk. That's fine. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Whatever. Let them have at it and let them shoot themselves into space while they're at it. But really the issue is competition between workers for fewer and fewer jobs. That's
That
really the issue. That's the destructive competition,
that
right?
competition
Productive
drives it. That drives it a lot
that
faster.
competition, it drives it. It's the result of it, I would say, and it depends on what we mean by it. It definitely drives our politics, right? It causes to some degree, like I'm not going to blame the working class. I'm not. I'm going to say that there are people who prey on the antisocial attitudes that come from the zero sum race to the bottom competition of the workers. So
Hmm.
there are people there to say you should hate workers of another race or another nationality or another gender because they're your competition. I don't think generally that's not the spontaneous attitude of the working class, but the social environment is conducive to it, and then it does produce some fringe antisocial movements, dehumanizing movements. It does, and ideologies. I'm not going to say that that's happen spontaneously. It doesn't exactly. The conditions are there spontaneously for it. Or international warfare, you know. Like I don't know, we'll get to it, but Israel-Palestine, it's like, okay, people fighting over land. Man, not so much. Are they fighting over land, or are they fighting over who gets to live decently because they're employed, and who gets to have like their own little racket state to take care of them as an ethnic group, right? Isn't it just Israel's more successful than the Palestinians at creating a little like national economy and little racket to like help its own people,
Well, they're
right?
were successful at getting the U.S. to pump billions into, I would imagine almost anyone could be
Into their
successful with that
arms
much money pumped
industry.
into. Yeah, yeah,
No,
yeah.
but that's not the basis of the Israeli economic success. It isn't.
No.
And actually, Israel was a
Okay.
pretty austere place for a long time, and so they've been successful in the neoliberal era. They have a high tech sector, basically, right? That's how they're successful. They're successful in the way that any neoliberal economy is successful. They do a lot of like tech and services type of stuff. Now they have their military subsidized, and I guess that helps. That might help like defer the cost of like an Israeli welfare state. But also, I'm not sure if the Israeli welfare state is all that generous, right? I mean,
Hmm.
in other words, there are more generous welfare states in the world. Israel has poor people. It does.
Hmm.
It absolutely does have poor people, right?
Does it?
I mean, Europe has poor people. This is what people don't understand. Europe has poor people, and they're not all immigrants either.
I mean, I kind of think of the Palestinians as Israel's poor people, but you're saying you were saying
If
within the.
only they were. If only they
Yeah.
were. If only they were the poor people that Israel exploited. But they're not. They're more like the left behind people. They're more like the marginal people. They're the ghettoized people,
Well, that's
right?
that's what I was getting at. That's what I was. They're the ghetto of Israel, is what I meant. So when you're saying poor, you mean specifically exploited workers.
Yeah, or exploitable, right? I
Mm.
mean, I live in Chicago. I've lived here for 31 years. There is a ghetto population, and they are not the basis of anyone's super profits because nobody's even trying to exploit them.
No.
If only they would be exploited,
Right. No, it would
right?
be
That's the
very.
problem.
It would be a lot less expensive, in a sort of sense, right? Because there is a
No, there's no use
cost.
for them though. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's no use for them. That's the thing. I mean, I was here, Rahm Emanuel Obama's chief of staff, he was infamous for saying about the Chicago public school system. He said, "What is the point of educating kids who are never going to have a job anyway?"
Oof. Yeah.
And that's real. That's the world that we actually live in, right? So the whole like there's no better way of getting out of poverty than education. Well, no, because there has to be a job waiting for you. Like, right? Like, education's not going to do it. You know, it's going to do it for a handful of people, but it's not going to do it for everybody. It's not going to do it for the bulk of people. It's not like you lift the entire impoverished population out of poverty, make them all middle class just by giving them education. No. And, so Rahm Emanuel was right when he said, look, it really doesn't make sense for us to invest this money in people who are worthless to us. And that goes for white poor people too.
Of course. Of
Right?
course. Of
Let's not
course.
forget that. There's a
Yeah.
whole world. The way that I like to put it is there are hella white people in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
There are hella poor white people. There are still more poor white people than poor people of color in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And they are also wanting to be exploited, but not.
Desperate to be exploited. Exactly. Yeah.
Right? So, and we can't be spellbound by that because again, history's moving on, capitalism marches on. We have to try to change the system. It's a moving proposition. It's in motion. We can't like, stop and just stare into the abyss here.
Sure.
You
So
know?
I'm on board with I think all that, but what I want to bring it back to, because we might as well get into it right now since you brought it up. So on Israel Palestine, let me just the everybody who's popping in who didn't already see the essay, I'm going to go ahead and controversially and oversimplistically like paraphrase it, and then you can correct
Uh-huh.
me. Okay, but
Uh-huh.
basically you're saying the two options given to all people who lose wars or trade deals is either slavery or genocide. Like you have these two hard options. And then I think you might have said something about how, like, wage labor is like obviously like a softer kind of slavery, but like ultimately you should want, if you're in the losing position, your desire should be to be exploited, because if you can't be exploited as a wage laborer or a slave, then you're going to be inevitably genocided. And so obviously that is a something that I don't think most people are used to hearing. It's
Harsh.
so, it's something that it's harsh. It's something that kind of articulated something I was already kind of feeling about all of this stuff. And I'll bring up some of the things I was thinking about Palestine and all of this activism around it. But I want to first just ask you if there's anything essential to that argument that you also want to add.
Yeah, so I mean that's the basic outline of the argument. I should also say, what's the point in saying so? Meaning, there is like the rhetoric character of it. So it's basic logical proposition. It's kind of unassailable. And in the meantime, one of the members of Platypus came up with an Engels quote that says the exact same thing that I'm saying. And of course, I'm just channeling the stuff that I've read in the past. And how slavery is an advance on genocide, Engels says, right? Or on extermination. They didn't have the word genocide. So slavery is an advance on extermination or cannibalism.
Mm-hmm.
So so there's that, but what's the point in saying so, right?
Yeah.
So there are a couple of different points in saying so. One is, if we are going to live in a world in which the way we talk about things and the way we conceive of things, the way we imagine things, is in terms of white settler colonialism and genocide, if that's like the world that we see around us, rather than a capitalist world with a contradiction of bourgeois social relations by industrial forces of production, if all of that is to like social imperialist, privileged white male, white settler colonialist discourse, because I've actually heard from my students at the Art Institute, Marxism is white settler colonialist discourse.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it no doubt is, right? So if we're gonna say that, then what are we left with? What is the view of the world that we have? Like the land
Your
back view
students,
of the
your
world.
students must love you, and you just go, "Yeah, no doubt it is."
Right. Right, of course, because they're like, Professor Cutrone, tell us that it's not. Say it ain't so. And I'm like, it is. Fuck. Why, like the Marx was he's a dead white male.
Oh.
He's like the deadest, straightest, whitest male. I mean, not too white. He was the Moor. He was Jewish or whatever, but he wasn't raised Jewish. So fuck it. He's the deadest, straightest, whitest, malest motherfucker. Right. And like he wasn't a settler colonialist because he was European, but he wanted to come to America. He wanted to move to Texas.
Nuh-uh.
Marx wanted to move to Texas, yeah. Because
No.
there was a whole German 1848 veteran socialist communist population in the United States. And
Son
he
of a
wanted to move
bitch.
to
Oh
Texas. And
man,
so
miss.
he would have been on stolen land, Marx on the ranch.
Dang, missed
Okay.
opportunity. Cowboy Marks almost happened.
Yeah, and he would have been writing Das Kapital at the
Fuck.
ranch.
Dude, he would have loved barbecue. Yeah.
Right. So
Okay.
basically, it's like if this is the worldview that we're stuck with now around like Israel-Palestine, that the US supports Israel because they're both white settler colonialist countries, then let's lean into that, shall we? Like, let's go with that.
Okay.
And then what do we conclude from that? Meaning, if we really are going to liquidate the question of capitalism and liquidate the question of bourgeois society, bourgeois social relations, bourgeois freedom, the emancipation from the world of slavery and caste and everything else, right of conquest. If we're going to liquidate all of that, then what are we left with? We are left with conquerors and conquered. We're left with who gets to genocide who based on who prevails through force, through violence. And if that's the basic worldview that we have, then how do we start reconstructing a Marxist framework out of that? And that's what I was doing.
So
Right? If we're gonna
you're
accept
accepting
this,
their white settler colonialism genocide perspective of world history.
history and the present, right? That this is just a continuation. That, in other words, we don't have to look at the actual history of Israel-Palestine or the actual history of Israel or of the Arab world or of the Palestinians. We don't have to look at political history, social history, economic history. We don't have to think about nationalism and Islamism. We don't, it's just Israelis and Palestinians. It's just two like kind of racial groups, maybe religious groups, but basically racial groups. And they're just fighting, and one is going to win and the other is going to lose, and whoever loses is genocided. If that's it, right? If we're going to be biblical like that,
Mm-hmm.
right? If it's going to be Amalek, and if it's going to be Moses coming out of Egypt, out of slavery, right? And God like genociding the Egyptians, right?
Right.
Old Testament type shit. Then okay, where where does Marxism fit into that? Well, start out from the standpoint of slavery. That's a start, because then you can look forward to a slave revolt. And also that language, because Norm Finkelstein, right? He's like, oh, October 7th was a slave revolt. Because
He does he
he's also said it's ghetto uprising, but the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, they all went to the concentration camp and were killed, right? So he's not really liking that one. He's liking Nat Turner revolt. He's liking slave revolt that leads to emancipation, even if decades later. And I'm like, okay, right? Let's adopt that framework.
So when I read it, I don't remember the
And
let's adopt this framework and I will proceed
I never said
as
that.
if.
No, no,
Okay.
no, no. I just run with it. Like, performative. I mean, a lot of my writing is performative.
Yeah.
This is not academic writing. This is not, I am going to show that. No, 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 fuck. I'm just going to do it.
Yeah. No, yeah.
Right?
The face you made right there too. I think it like everyone can probably get everything they need to know for sure right there. Like that's it. That's the
Uh-huh.
clip, everybody. Just gonna run with it, And I like that you do that because it means that you're not worried about the inevitable people taking this thing you said and saying that this is who you are down to your bones or what. You don't care. Your writing is meant to
Well,
do something.
yeah, I'm a little bit pre-canceled. I'm a little bit especially on the Palestine issue, because there was like a boycott letter against Platypus where the leaked email, and it's like where I say, well, what's the rational kernel of Israeli anti-Palestinian racism, right? And and it's like the 100th email in a 100 email thread where I was trying to have a mic drop moment with the Platypus kids, because I was like, let's just stop talking about this. And so let's just fuck, like, yeah, the Israelis are racist, of course, right? But wouldn't you be racist if you were dealing with people who are just, like suicide bombing? Right? And then wouldn't it make you wonder, do they value human life the way we do? Are they like different from us? Right? That kind of racism. I
Yeah.
mean, and it's kind of like, because I just feel like it's so I'm pre-canceled on that issue. And I haven't changed my mind on it. And I've thought the same way since high school. Like since, Israel-Palestine is a depressing issue.
Yeah,
And it
there's
brings out the worst in everybody.
okay. And so
It's horrible, and it's horrible. Look, I always say this, so I'll just say it. I look at things from the Palestinian perspective. In other words, when I look at that situation, I'm thinking of myself as a resident of Gaza. I'm not thinking of myself as like, oh, I'm behind my manicured lawn. I'm in Israel. I'm a suburban white person. And then these people come and kill me. No, I'm thinking I'm living in the open air prison, right? World's largest concentration camp, and the Hamas motherfuckers, who I have to sort of dodge on the street all the time, went and attacked these people who are now bombing us. That's how I'm looking at it. And I'm like, fuck, my life was shitty, and now I'm being bombed. because these people decided it was a good idea to provoke Goliath into bombing me.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
I'm looking at it from the Palestinian standpoint, and I'm like, I would rather be slave labor than be killed. I really would.
yeah, but they don't get to be slave labor either, though. That's I think that's the natural
No, but
follow up, right?
that's the problem, and that's the other thing that I was really trying to stick in people's craw, which is, well, the problem, of course, that the Palestinians aren't even slave labor. You
Like
know,
they
they
can't.
aren't even the Bangladeshi workers, 6,000 of whom died building the soccer stadium in Qatar for the World Cup. 6,000 workers died building that fucking stadium because there is slave labor in the world.
Yeah.
The Palestinians are even worse off than the workers, the migrant workers who are exploited in the Gulf by the Gulf states. You know, and it's Muslim on Muslim, right? So that's the other thing, right? And so why is it Bangladeshi workers in Qatar? Because it's Muslim on Muslim exploitation. And of course it's racialized too, because the Arabs look down on the non-Arab Muslims. And of course they're like, yeah, you can come build our soccer stadium, but if thousands of you die doing it, we don't care. Palestinians are worse off than that in some
And
ways.
and so, I get that it's a depressing situation and that there's been no realistic solutions being advanced by anybody who's got a serious ability to do anything, much less any organizations.
Right.
It all seems like
Right.
there's a human aid industry, and then there's obviously like the Israeli defense funding, and then that's the
I would be remiss to say that the article that you're citing is the most recent article of mine, The Alternative to Genocide and Subplation. But it's actually based on another article that I wrote that I published in Platypus earlier this year on Israel-Palestine and the left. And both of those are in the Marxism and Politics book. So those are late additions to the theoretical writings book, because it actually has theory in it, right? It's not just commenting on current events. And in that piece, I take up the concept of genocide and how it's inherently ambiguous, hypocritical, problematic. And I also bring up, like Lenin on these questions, and but really the history now that has led us to this point. And that's, I feel like that's part of the story, meaning, again, things have not always been this way. It's not like everything's been the same since 1948 in Israel-Palestine. That's not true, right? So, and I'm afraid with young people, especially now, we're dealing with like Zoomers, we're dealing with like, college kids. My students who walked out of my class, not to boycott me, but because there was a national walkout,
okay.
right? And they walked out of my class, and I was like, "You're really walking out of my class? You're gonna miss like this, like crucial, precious Marxism to do a pointless gesture?" And they're like, "Yes, this is our time. We have to make a statement." And I'm like, "Okay." But the basic point there is the protests are pushing on an open door. The Biden administration is already trying to pressure Israel. Could they be pressuring them more? Yeah, maybe, but maybe not, right? Meaning Israel's going to do what it's going to do. And the US isn't backing Israel to the hilt. It isn't. Not even the Republicans will. Even Trump is annoyed with Netanyahu. What the United States wants, what the US ruling class wants, is a two-state solution. They really want a two-state solution. They do
You're
not
saying
want
that
this.
Netanyahu wants that?
No, the US
Sorry, I miss you.
ruling class wants it, and
Okay.
Netanyahu's in their way. Like, in
Okay,
other words,
okay, okay.
Netanyahu is
Yeah, yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
doing what the US ruling class wants. He's
And do you
not.
do you think it's do you think it is like something that's unique to Netanyahu, or is it somehow like something deeper than this human being. Like, I don't know, like,
Well, I mean,
is there a party apparatus behind him and he's
of
merely the
course, of
figure?
course.
Is
Yeah,
he
yeah, of
merely the
course.
figurehead of it? Is he pretty much replaceable and Israel would still have the same position? Or if they switch him out, like, would things probably
Look,
change?
things are
Like,
contingent. This is why people get very upset about the issue, because it's not like some inexorable law of history or something. So in the Israel-Palestine, the left, I bring up that Horkheimer and Adorno, turns out it was just Horkheimer, and it wasn't even him voicing his own opinion, but he was voicing some other perspective, that like, oh, the movement of world history means the destruction of small nations, meaning the extermination of the Jews in the Holocaust. And he's like, I guess we got to go with that because that's just the march of history. So it's not that kind of an argument. I mean, look, obviously it's contingent. Israel can do different things. It might, in fact, depend on which party is in power, what they do, like
yeah,
what actual policy they adopt and what military measures they take. And so, no, things are contingent. They are. And that's the thing that's maddening, is that
sure.
when you fix that, then you have to think, well, okay, so what do you want them to do? And then it's like, well, but Israel shouldn't exist. And it's like, okay, but then you're leaving the political realm.
Yeah,
Then you are in this like science fiction-y, or it's really more like fantasy, like J.R.R. Tolkien or Game of Thrones kind of world, right? It's not even like a science fiction fantasy. It's more like, oh yeah, it's the elves and the orcs and the hobbits and whatever, and it's
right, right.
Mordor, and it's kind of like, okay, but really what do you want? And that was my other point, is that things were very hysteric to my mind.
Yeah,
Because in fact, people didn't want anything other than what the ruling class was already doing, was already wanting.
right. What's your the two-state solution?
Yeah. And I've been around long enough to know that the two-state solution is not a good solution, because it is the institutionalization of the ghettoization of the Palestinians. In other words, that is not a just outcome. The just outcome would be a one-state solution, right? A democratic Israel-Palestine, equal rights for all. But is that happening? In other words, if the far right in Israel dominates politically, and if the far right in Palestine dominates politically, if Hamas really is the dominant political force among the Palestinians, if they held an election tomorrow, Hamas would win, supposedly, in both the West Bank and Gaza. I'm not so sure, but let's just grant that. Then, okay, so the far right in Israel and Hamas, neither of them want a one-state solution.
Right.
Neither of them want a Jewish and Arab, Muslim and Christian one state where everyone has equal rights. None of them want that. In which case, then, and the US ruling class knows that. Biden knows that. Trump knows that. So they're just like, okay, these people don't want to live together. So what's the best possible scenario? A two-state solution.
Hmm.
Right? And yet, right, the parties on the ground also don't want that. So
Is
it's a very intractable problem.
hmm. Yeah, and that so this opens up a lot of cans of worms, and I can see chat's going crazy. All these people arguing about stuff. I'm not gonna keep up with chat, folks. You all can tag me if you want me to say anything or bring anything up. But there was so I wanted to bring it back to Finkelstein, and I wanted to uh, I think defend what I take to be what it is he's doing with the example that you were bringing up. I saw some people in chat trying to do so as well. But first, I just want to say I think that maybe the worst thing that happened for Gaza was that it was the US activist left that took up its cause after
How do you mean? Why would you say that?
after a
It's a
decade
bad representation.
after a decade of making everybody hate and distrust it. I don't know, crying wolf all the time. Like that's what it's like the US left. When I say US left, I'm using this term
Uh-huh.
very very loosely, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're talking about the people who think that you shouldn't be able to have a job if you think that a woman is a person who has a womb, like that kind of shit. Like we're talking about people who say that that position is fascism. That's crying wolf. We're talking about the
I see.
people who,
I
for the
see.
last 10 years, have been the terror of regular working people who see their celebrities being crucified for things that they themselves also believe. Uh, and then those people are the ones who are saying there's a genocide happening. Why would you trust anybody from the
Who's
activist
saying that?
left? Yeah.
That's true. No, I mean, I would say that we're dealing with a small milieu. In other words, I would say the working class is largely either apolitical on the issue or would, basically be opposed to terrorism, but also be sympathetic to the Palestinian plight. Like a very, straightforward kind of, you don't want to see people be terrorists, but you also don't want to see them mistreated either.
Yeah.
Right. And so we're dealing with something else. We're dealing with a very small echo chamber milieu of people. Unfortunately, people whose consciousness is my concern, the left, you know. And you know, I've been chastised, I've been criticized for what people have interpreted, which is incorrect, but let's just entertain this idea for a moment, which is trying to translate the critique of wokeism into a critique of the pro-Palestine movement. Right. So in other words, treating the pro-Palestinian protests like BLM, like the George Floyd protests. In other words, as a kind of pseudo-radicalism that feeds into the Democratic Party.
Right.
And what people will say is, well, no, because that was under Trump, but this is under Biden, and so this is against the Democrats. And I always like to point out, well, BLM started under Obama. And so in many ways, we've returned, just like Me Too and BLM both started under Obama and were
Right.
both about disappointment with the Democrats. And these are also protests that are about disappointment with the Democrats. And I thought at the time, and I certainly still think in retrospect, that the BLM protests of 2020 were not really against Trump. They were against Biden and Kamala Harris, who looked like they were going to replace Trump. In other words, there was a sense that Trump was going to lose the election because of COVID, and the Democrats were going to come back. And the George Floyd protests, because in the local cities, these were protests against Democratic Party administrations of those cities. Right. So the protests happened in Democrat cities, Democrat
No,
governed states.
100%.
Right. And
100%.
they were just basically saying, okay, if you come to power, we're going to expect more from you than Obama gave us.
Mm.
Right. And that's the same thing now, which is to say that, because Netanyahu's been there for a while. So I pointed out that nobody's happy with Netanyahu. Obama didn't like Netanyahu. Trump doesn't like Netanyahu, and Biden doesn't like Netanyahu. So Netanyahu's been a thorn in the side of the American ruling class for 2 decades. And
So, yeah, sorry, keep
that's
going.
just the
Yeah.
reality. And so what we're dealing with now is frustration with Biden. And of course, their attitude is they don't care whether Biden is reelected or not. Of course they do. Of course, they'd rather have Biden than Trump because they imagine that Trump is even more pro-Israel than Biden is. I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think that Trump might have more success pressuring the Israelis than Biden does. Right. So we need to understand that politics is a complex negotiation,
Right.
and sometimes the harder line person has more chance of achieving reform than the conciliatory person.
For sure.
Right.
Now,
And
so to say
so,
that the BLM
and vice
movement
versa, by the way.
after Bernie, which it was also, there was a movement, and
Yes.
that movement crumbled, and in its disintegration it turned into racial politics,
I
uh
think so. I think
which is
it's always
very,
there, but I think so. And I think especially in the activist milieu. So in other words, there
for sure.
were BLM, so-called, not necessarily, they weren't really BLM. There were protests and riots that were not about the activist milieu. That were more spontaneous. Um, like I guess we had, ghetto uprisings the way we did back in LA back when I was, 22. But but in terms of the activists, in terms of the left, in terms of their perspective on it and their takeaway from it and their orientation regarding it, again, among those people, then yes, I think that it was um, a protest against an impending Kamala Harris and Joe Biden administration. Kamala Harris, who's a very draconian prosecutor, very pro-police, very draconian prosecutor, and
Right.
Joe Biden, who authored the crime bill back in the 90s.
Right. Right.
Right.
No, I think that's I never I don't think I ever for a moment saw any of that as a reaction against Trump. I saw it as a reaction to push the Democrats left, which is just
Yeah.
stupid. So
I
here's the
mean,
thing is
it has
like,
some, it depends on what you want. It depends on what you think pushing them to the left is. But go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say like the reason I think it's a bad strategy is because I think from the standpoint of somebody who is 20 years old,
Hmm.
pushing the left means pushing progressive parents into a slightly more uncomfortable position so that they do something, right? And it's just like it's the idea that they can do something, and that
Right.
and that this focus of all change must be put on making progressives who are comfortable less comfortable so they
Right.
do something.
Right.
The when it comes down to things like looting, what you're doing is you are giving everyone else just cause to be like, fuck those guys. And ultimately
Right.
that does go the opposite direction, right? Like,
Yes.
well, because Biden's not going to do anything about it, right? He's going to capitulate. And of course, well, that opens up
Also,
several
what can be done about it? What can be done about it? In other words, I mean, some things can be done, but they won't be done, and not
yeah.
because, people are dead set against doing it, but because there is a lack of political will and social support. Policing can be reformed,
Yeah.
right? So defund the police, abolish the police is stupid because actually the police are going to be there and they can actually do better
Yeah.
than they do. Right? Like some reform can happen. It's just like this situation, right? It's not like, oh, okay. I mean, I guess I'll say about the October 7th, post October 7th Gaza war, that's been happening. I I felt, because I myself felt this, but I felt the left in the face of the October 7th attack were like, holy shit, what's Israel going to do to the Palestinians now? And they were very fearful of the Israeli response, and rightfully so. But I think that there's been a kind of desperate attempt to say October 7th doesn't justify the Israeli response. And it's like, well, of course, that's true. Of course, October 7th does not justify what's going on now. Absolutely not. But not because you have to get into this whole thing like it didn't start on October 7th or something, or go back to 1948 or go back to historical Zionism or something. No, you don't have to do that. You can say, of course, there was a context for Hamas and a context for Hamas being in power in Gaza. But then you can also say, well, what is Hamas launching this attack on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, another sneak attack on Israel? What is that? Like, can you discreetly say, was that a good action or not? But then people are like, well, you can't criticize that, because if you do, then somehow you're giving into Israeli propaganda, you're justifying the Israeli response. And again, but I'm looking at it from another angle. I'm not looking at it from the Israeli standpoint, which is what everyone else is looking at it from. They're looking at it from the Israeli standpoint. They're saying what Israel should and should not do, and they're thinking of like Israel should be self-denying the way all good white people are self-denying, right? And it's like, well, no, right? And then that's where they're like, Hamas doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. Don't even raise it. Don't even mention it. And October 7th doesn't matter. But it does matter, actually, because it's a tactic, it's a strategy, there's a politics behind it, there's a goal in mind, and all of that has to be open to criticism, especially from the left, because we don't share that goal. We don't have Hamas's goal. We don't, or we should not, to establish an Islamist theocracy.
Dude, that's been
No.
my goal all along. That's it, right? That's
I mean,
oh,
look, I always like to say, I've gamed it out for myself. So I've been a leftist a long time, but I also took some time off from the left and tried to put the pieces back together for myself and like reconstruct things for myself. Read, learned, studied, thought for a good like more than 10 years, almost 15 years. And of course I thought, well, is the world going to overcome capitalism through radical feminism? Is it going to overcome capitalism through queerism? Is it going to overcome capitalism through Islamism? I gamed it out. I was like, yeah, maybe okay, let's think about the process by which that might happen, right? So if militant Islam like reestablishes the caliphate, establishes like hardcore Islamic society in the Muslim world, and then takes on the world, in a battle for supremacy, is that going to be the way that capitalism is overcome? Because I'm very familiar, people on the left are like, well, Islam is more caring about people, right? It's more social welfare oriented. Well, of course it is not. But so I've thought about that, and maybe historically it was not, but maybe now in the era of capitalism, Islam has to be more like objectively socialistic or leftist or something. We were talking about Midwestern Marx. They just had a discussion about this, about like, is the Islamic Republic of Iran socialist? And they concluded it is. Yeah. And it's like, okay, so I gamed it out and I thought, okay, maybe the future belongs to Islam, except it doesn't, right? Because there are internal divisions and that's already backward looking. I don't think that Islamism is the future. I think it's the past, and not the 8th century past. It's the past like the 70s and 80s. It's the past like the 90s, meaning it comes out of the failure of Arab nationalism. But it belongs, I think Zizek wrote about this, that fundamentalism belongs to the neoliberal era. It really is an expression of neoliberalism, whether it's Christian fundamentalism or Islamic fundamentalism. It belongs to that neoliberal era. And that's not going to be the future. Hamas is not the future. Hamas is the past. And they did the attack that they did because they know that their window of opportunity is closing.
do you believe they did do it?
Oh, you mean, did they do it or did Israel actually do it?
Yeah. Did Israel actually do it?
Or did Israel allow it to happen?
Or a lot? Yeah, that's the more likely, probably right. But
I don't think so. I don't think Israel allowed it to happen intentionally.
I don't
I
want to
think there
spend.
was
I
competence.
don't want to spend a lot of time in conspiracy theory realm here, but I do want to
The
just
reason that
also say,
people
I
think
do want to
about that,
also ask you that question though. Like, do you also think that one of the reasons why Israel is succeeding in taking U.S. money to do something that goes against the opinions and interest of the U.S. ruling class is because they might have something on the majority of that ruling class, or at least major key
oh, you
players?
mean like Jeffrey Epstein was actually working
Yeah,
for Mossad?
that kind of thing. Yeah, that kind of thing.
No.
You don't
Because you
think
know
there's anything
what?
to that?
No, I think that if the US ruling class are really hollow earth reptilians who are a
Oh, come on.
pedophile ring, no, if they, because you'd have to be a hollow earth reptilian to be a total pedophile ring, like solid ruling class conspiracy, right?
Why?
Um, because how would you keep disciplined enough to keep it under wraps,
People get
Like how
killed
would
all the time. People get killed all the time, and then nobody talks about it because you'll get called a conspiracy
That's true.
theorist.
That's true, but that's just normal gangsterism. The capitalists are gangsters.
Yeah. Well,
But they don't have to be any particular conspiracy of gangsters. There's a default conspiracy. Let's put it that way. And I don't think that Israel has anything on the US ruling class. No. I think that um no, I think things are a lot more mundane and straightforward. The reason that conspiracy theories are not good is that they attribute too much significance to things.
okay.
In other words, accidents happen, mistakes occur. There is incompetence. And I think that I think that the viciousness of the Israeli response also comes out of um, a sense that they screwed up, that they could have prevented the October 7th attack, but they made a mistake. They were incompetent. They
See,
got their eye off the ball.
I,
But
I,
yeah, I'm not
I,
looking at it from their standpoint. I
I,
can just sort of say that,
I
but I'm
find
not
that
looking at it from their standpoint.
I find that fascinating because I just like here's the thing I don't know I've met some Israelis along
Uh-huh.
the way. I've met a couple, but I
Yeah.
have no fucking idea what anybody could possibly think. Um,
It would give them an
just
excuse for
justifies
ethnic cleansing. No,
no
that's
no
that
what in the world possibly justifies like we'll just say the disproportionality of the response. Like what in the world could possibly make? I mean, I just actually am baffled. Like it's like I don't outside of politics. It's just like how do you think that's going to look good or fare well for you in the long term? How, here's why I know there's not a conspiracy with Jews behind it.
yeah,
I've been saying this all year, but and everyone's free to steal it. But like
yeah.
the reason that I know that there's not that the Jews don't run
This is
everything
backfiring. Yeah.
is because they'd be better at their propaganda game. They'd be a lot better at the propaganda. They're not good at propaganda at all, and they've lost that war from basically the beginning.
Perhaps. I mean, I mean there are many aspects of this. Um I mean, look, then you're in the realm of like policy differences, meaning there is a domestic opposition in Israel. There is. There is dissent against the war policy in Israel,
Yeah,
including in the
yeah,
war cabinet itself,
yeah,
right? So, but again, that's looking at things from the Israeli standpoint.
right.
Don't,
Yeah,
right?
but
And I
yeah, but
know that most people do.
but
They most
but
people do because they think, if I were in charge instead of these bad people in charge, what would I do?
right.
Right? And it's like, but wait, there are other actors. There are other actors. And Hamas planned this attack for a long time. Hamas is a multi-billion dollar operation, you know, and they they do things. They plan and execute things, meaning they are they are not, it's not just kids on the street, right?
Which is how Finkelstein talks about it, right?
Yeah. And because, he wants to exclude a moral consideration, but for me, that's less important than a political consideration. Because, maybe, I mean, maybe you put aside morality, like you want to terrorize the Israeli population, so you do some horrific atrocities against civilians among people who are sympathetic to the Palestinians. You commit atrocities against those people. Like maybe that's a sensible thing to do. I don't know. So it's not like a moral thing. It's strictly, from my perspective, does it work? And what does it work at doing? What does it accomplish? And so the first thing that I have to say is Hamas does not care about the number of Palestinian civilians who die. Hamas does not care. They do not. They don't care any more than the Israelis do.
I don't imagine
So
that they
that's the
do.
first
Yeah,
thing. No, they
yeah,
just don't. They say so.
right.
A nation of martyrs.
I don't know, man. I think that like
And these are serious
the
people. These are political people. These are not just deranged psychopaths. They've made a
yeah,
political calculation, which is it's worth it to get rid of Israel. In other words, that this undermines Israel. It's worth 50,000, 100,000 Palestinians dying to fatally wound Israel long term, which is what they think this is accomplishing.
and they
And it
might
might
have,
actually work. It
and they
might
might
actually
have.
work, right? But towards what end? In other words, is the political goal of the left, of socialists, of Marxists, the destruction of the state of Israel? Is that the goal? Right? No,
Now,
seriously.
now maybe.
No, I mean seriously. Like in other words, the destruction of the state of Israel, not a socialist revolution in the Middle East, but the destruction of the state of Israel. That's our priority. And then the
Yeah,
idea would be reasoning backwards. it would be, well, the biggest obstacle to socialism in the Middle East is the state of Israel. And I'm like, really? Not Saudi Arabia, not Turkey, not Egypt, not Iran, not Syria. Like, really? The biggest obstacle to socialism in the Middle East is Israel? Really?
Really?
Right? That's what they think. And it's like, children, you have not thought.
Yeah.
Right? If you think the Jordanian monarchy, the Gulf states, the Gulf monarchies, the Saudi monarchy, the military, bureaucratic, Arab nationalist, something or other, state of Egypt, Erdogan, Turkey, Islamism, the Islamic Republic of Iran, you don't think that those are bigger obstacles to socialism in the Muslim world than the state of Israel? Right? Because I just know, like, look, if you want to know who destroyed the Iranian left, it wasn't the Shah, it was the Islamic Republic. That's what destroyed the socialist working class left in Iran, which existed. It did exist. The Shah repressed it but couldn't eliminate it. Who eliminated it? The Islamists. That's who successfully eliminated it. The Shah could never eliminate it. The Islamists did. So if you think Israel is the obstacle to socialism in the Middle East, you don't know your history. You really don't. So again, if the destruction of the state of Israel is the goal and all means to accomplish that goal are legitimate, have at it, children. That's not my goal. That's not what I'm here to think about or to teach people about. I'm here to think and teach people about socialism.
Okay.
And also, Israel is not an obstacle to struggle for socialism in the United States unless we let it be. Meaning, AIPAC is not the obstacle to struggle for socialism in the United States unless we let it be. In other words, if we let Israel-Palestine divide the left, divide the socialist left, divide the political Marxist left, then, yeah, I guess Israel's an obstacle to the struggle for socialism in the United States. Only if we let it be. It's
And
not.
that also then assumes that there's basically this anti-war or at least third worldist approach versus socialism. These are the two directions
It's ass
for
backwards, right? You
for
know
the
the Jamal
left.
Bowman, the squad guy, Jamal Bowman, he's being like primaried by AIPAC. They're trying to get rid of one of the squad members, more than one of the squad members, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, the Zionist lobbyists for Israel are trying to get rid of the squad.
Mm.
Well, why did the squad put them in a position where they could be primaried out on this issue? Like, in other words, if these people really care about Medicare for all, if they really care about decreasing police violence against minority communities, why are they letting themselves be killed by this issue? Why are they letting themselves be defeated? If this is the progressive caucus in Congress to make urgent reforms, why are they letting themselves be, why are they putting themselves, setting themselves up to be the targets of the Zionist lobby?
I mean,
Why? Why?
because
Because
it
they're like, oh,
seems
stand
because
on
it
principle
because this
against
is
genocide.
but
We're going
this
to
is
go
the,
down fighting. We're going to go down nobly.
but this is the Vietnam of a generation. That's the easy answer, right?
It absolutely is not. Meaning, it absolutely is not. It's just, and people should
But they feel
remember.
that way. They feel that way, and so do all the students who are involved. Of course, they see it that
I
way.
guess so. Well, then they should remember that the Vietnam anti-war movement brought us Nixon, and it's
Yeah,
bringing us Trump.
somebody in the chat was saying that the Viet Cong certainly didn't take this slavery versus genocide off. They chose resistance, and as a result, after a long
The
period of
Viet
time,
Cong
they
were
were
not
able to.
resistors. They're not, it's not a resistance movement. It was a revolutionary movement. I mean, I have my criticism of the Vietnamese communists, but they were not resisting shit. They were insurrectionists. They were trying to overthrow a state, South Vietnam, and they succeeded. So that's different. You know, Hamas is doing something else. Look, the Viet Cong were not terrorists. They might have been called terrorists, but they weren't terrorists. They didn't do this. They didn't do what Hamas does. They didn't do what the PLO did, right? The PLO before Hamas.
Can
They didn't
you,
do what the PFLP or the DFLP. They
is
just
it,
didn't do
is it,
indiscriminate slaughter of civilians as a pressure tactic. In other words, they were aiming to actually take power. They weren't doing pressure tactic, doing like indirect pressure tactic. They were an actual insurrectionary movement to overthrow the state. Now, look, the Palestinians, I guess, know that they're not in the position to do that. Like these groups, like not the Palestinians, the leadership that has dominated the Palestinians since 1967, PLO and now Hamas, and their fringe allies like the Marxists, the Democratic Front, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. So I guess they're doing asymmetric warfare, they're doing this, they're doing that. Well, yeah, but there are other things. There are other things you can do. And there are other things that could have been done along the way. At this late date, it might seem like there are no other options. But how did we get to this point where there are no other options? There's a history here. It's not all Israel's doing.
okay.
Palestinian misleadership has created this situation
So
as much as the Israelis have.
that's kind of what I want to focus back on, because your position on how you said, well, it's not from the Israeli standpoint, it is from the Palestinian standpoint. You are thinking, okay, so if I was there, if that was
I
in this
was a
situation,
Palestinian leftist, a Palestinian socialist, a Palestinian Marxist. What would I think? I would think the PLO and Hamas are my enemies because
sure.
they are.
But
And
then
by the
you're
way, me being an American Marxist and socialist, they're my enemies too, right? As an American socialist and Marxist. I mean, Netanyahu's my enemy, right?
for
The
sure.
Israeli state is my enemy. The Palestinian Authority is my enemy. Hamas's racket in Gaza is my enemy. The US state and ruling class are my enemy. But these other people are also my enemies.
Well, and
And
that's
why do I say that? Because as an American Marxist, as an American socialist, I know that any Palestinian Marxists and socialists I know that Hamas and the PLO are their enemies,
sure.
not just Israel,
But some
not
enemies are
only
more,
Israel.
some enemies are more enemies. Like
Are they?
yeah,
Are they?
like your boss in capitalism is not as bad an enemy as a terrorist, for instance. Like,
Well, that's a different matter. It's enemy in which respect? Meaning, you know, I mean, I am aware of the history of the left, and I'm aware of the fact that it's sometimes other leftists have damaged the movement more than the state has.
kind of where I'm going with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the problem here, by the way, is that the left that polices the protests around Palestine, the people who would want to cancel me, right?
But who wouldn't? Come on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. I mean, because again, they'd rather try to cancel me or try to vilify me than admit that there's anything worth thinking about here, right? Like, should you really be like, like the PFLP? I bring up the PFLP because they're like the prominent Marxists in Gaza. And their attitude is Hamas is leading the national liberation struggle, and we're not going to let ideological differences get in the way. We're going to support them. And they participated in the October 7th attack and everything, right? They probably didn't do the atrocities. They probably did other things. They probably concentrated on military targets, the PFLP. But, I kind of feel like, okay, that's a problem. Meaning, if it's like first we let the Islamo-fascists do their thing, and then at some later date we do our thing. And it's like, but in the meantime, the possibility of organizing people for socialism is degraded. And it's degraded here. Like, let's say, okay, there isn't much opportunity for a Palestinian working class to organize itself as a socialist political force. But the
Is there?
way the Palestinian is not, right? So,
Oh, there's not.
but
Okay, yeah. Well, because they don't
yeah, it's
have
not.
a workforce, so how would that work? Yeah.
I mean, they do. And there is an Israeli left, and there are connections made
But it's not
between
a
the Israeli
workforce
and the
that
Palestinian left.
anything in the world is really depending on. So it's like those workers stop the machine. It doesn't stop anything for everyone else. Like no one's going to be like, "Oh
That's
no,
not the
Palestinians decided to sit down and not work today." That's not going to do anything, right? Like,
right. I mean, exactly. I mean, look, but Israel still needs Palestinian labor. They do.
do they?
Yeah, yeah, they do. Otherwise, they wouldn't use it at all. They only use it because they need to. In other words, they have every reason not to use it, and yet they still do use it. And that includes Palestinian labor in the West Bank settlements. There are Palestinians who work on the Israeli West Bank settlements.
Okay.
Right? So the West Bank settlements can't happen without Palestinian labor. That's a reality, right? So, again, I'm looking at it from two standpoints. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of the Palestinians, but also from the standpoint of where I am, which is America, right? Which is how is the ideology of this nominally pro-Palestinian protest movement, how is this helping build a movement for socialism in the United States that could actually do real solidarity with Palestinian workers and Palestinian leftists, right? Because now it's all mediated through not just Palestinian nationalism, which was bad enough, but Islamism, which is even worse. So it used to be mediated through, like, international solidarity had to be in the terms of Palestinian nationalism, which I think was bad, wrong, right wing enough itself. But now it's Islamism. And this is not helping here, it's not helping there. But again, if I, resituate myself, I'm an American leftist. Who's my audience? You know,
So
it's not helping here. It really isn't. It's
s-
miseducating people
what I want,
about the nature of social reality, right? This is not a white settler colonialist country. It's a capitalist country. There's a big difference. It's miseducating people.
I,
Israel is not a settler colonial state, it's a capitalist state, right? Because that's how you're going to get at the possibility of changing it. To my mind, I'm a Marxist. In other
so
words, I don't think that I mean, yeah, you can change things militarily, who wins, who loses, who gets to genocide who. But that's just not the way I'm thinking about things. And also that's just not going to happen. So that's the other thing. Back in October, right after the October 7th attack, I said to Doug Lane on one of the podcasts, I said, "Can we fast forward to the end of this movie, please? We all know how it's going to end. It's not going to end with genocide or ethnic cleansing, but it's also not going to be anything other than a military victory by Israel. So can we fast forward this movie? Can we jump to the end? Right? Like maybe young people think, oh, the US is going to do something, and Israel's going to lose in some way. No, I've been here before for a long time. I know how this movie ends. I've seen this movie time and time again. It's not going to be different this time. The reason it's not going to be different this time is that there is no political alternative this time. The same political players are there that have always been there, both here and there. And
o-
if there was a socialist party in Israel and a socialist party in the United States, and we were coordinating, and there was a socialist movement among the Palestinians, and we were all part of one socialist international together, then there would be a possibility of a different outcome. But given what we have, we know what the outcome is. So let's just fast forward to the end, right? And I'd rather not watch this movie again. I didn't have to watch this movie again, but this is all that they're playing on cable the last 9 months. So I got to watch it again. But I kind of know, so, I'm going to go off and do some other things and it might be on in the background, but I know how
right.
this movie ends.
Well, So outside of it already being a genocide, already being like
If
technically
if
a
we if we
genocide.
must say if we must say that that's the case, but then it's again, I think that
Well,
the
why would we
term
not say it? Why would we not say it? Why do you
oh
feel like
because
we
it's a
must
useless
say it?
term.
Why what?
Well, I don't think it's a genocide. I don't even think that it's ethnic cleansing. I don't think that it's any more now than it's ever been. But I also don't think that that's the best way of going at it from the beginning. 20% of the Israeli population is Arab, is Palestinian. And I think maybe even a little bit more than that are Arab Palestinian people who are very pro-Israel, like the Bedouins and the Druze, right? So Muslims who are see themselves as oppressed by the dominant Arab Muslims, but also Druze, non-Muslim Arabs, are very pro-Israel in Israel. And then there's also just a traditional Arab population in Israel, 20%. Yeah. They're not being genocided. So it's not a genocide. They're not being ethnically cleansed. Nobody's kicking them out. This is just not true. Just not accurate.
I mean, they don't
Not
have
true.
anywhere to go, and everything's getting leveled. And whenever they're told to go somewhere, they go
No, no,
over
no,
there
not in
and get bombed
Israel. Not in
again.
Israel. In Israel, like behind Green Line Israel. Like we're not talking about the occupied territories now.
Oh,
So
okay.
leave aside Gaza and the West Bank. In
Because that's what I
Israel
was talking
itself,
about.
more than 20% of the population are not Jews, and they are not being ethnically displaced or genocided.
Oh, I see. But
So you cannot
but they're
say
not
Israel has
they're
a
not
genocidal
Palestinian.
policy.
But
They are
what percentage?
Palestinians, of course. They were there. They
Well,
were
what
just the
percentage of
ones
that
who.
20%? What percentage of that 20% is Palestinian? And
No,
also,
they
those are
they were always there. They were always there. In other words, those are the people who were there. Historically, they were there. Like they were not the people who fled or were kicked out. So there were people who fled who weren't allowed to return to their homes. And then there were people who were kicked out of their homes. But there were people who fled who were not allowed back. And then there are the people who did not flee and who were not kicked out. And that's 20% of the Israeli population.
okay. And see, so I've heard that used as a way of saying, well, you see, Israel is actually multicultural or something like that, and it
Well, it is. It of course is, because of course Jews are not a monolithic bloc in Israel either. So the majority of Jews in Israel are not European descended Jews. They're Middle Eastern Jews at this point, and they tend to vote for the right wing.
hmm.
Right? They're not the ruling class, but they tend to vote for the right wing parties.
Okay.
So they
So
tend to be lower on the socioeconomic spectrum. It
so
is
I
multicultural, right?
I wanna take several of the threads here and kind of just put them on a
Now
back
that
burner.
doesn't justify anything. All of that does not excuse any
No,
Israeli
I understand.
policies. Right? In other words, the
I don't
Israeli
read you that way. No,
policies, right? But
no.
just to be clear, right? It's not like, oh, Chris is using right wing or Zionist talking points. No, fuck. We have to understand that there are realities that are not talking points, right? So it's up to us to take things and interpret them, not just say, well, if you point at that, there's an automatic interpretation that's a right wing talking point, right? Because I think that's what people, again, they just want to focus on some things, not other things, because they think, well, don't bring that up, because it's like, don't bring up Hamas, don't bring up the atrocities on October 7th, because that's just a Zionist talking point. That's just propaganda. And it's like, but no, it's real. And we have to deal with reality. We have to try to change the world in reality, which we're not going to do just by ignoring things or by misrepresenting things. So the rhetoric of genocide is not helpful. It's not accurate. It's not helpful. Politically, it's not good. Like, I understand people want to do the pressure tactics, like the legalistic pressure tactics. They want the International Court of Justice to find that Israel is guilty of genocide. They want the International Criminal Court to find that Netanyahu has committed, and his administration and Israeli military officers have committed war crimes. Cool. That's not going to change anything. Like, in other words, like you can drag Netanyahu to The Hague. You think that's going to change anything for the Palestinians? It's not.
But it sounds like you're saying something.
Uh-huh.
that is confusing. So I want to try to get
Okay.
clear on it. So it
Okay.
sounds like on the one side, you're saying when you take up this Palestinian position of what is to be done, you go, and I would say this all follows reasonably. Okay, Hamas is the enemy. So is Israel. Okay, the only real solution is organizing socialism, but there's no real worker move. Well, we kind of got into that a little bit. We can come back to it, but the main thing I'm struggling with here is you're saying it's not a genocide, but then the piece that you wrote that this is about was saying that the only two
Oh,
options
sure.
are slavery or
Sure.
genocide.
Sure. In other words, I was leaning into the rhetoric and the imagination and conceptualization that people have that I don't think is good or accurate or helpful or meaningful. I really don't.
That
But if
people
we were to
have
adopt
in
that,
that you're saying that people have in Palestine. That's the way that a standard
no, that the
Palestine.
American left has. Who's reading my article?
Well,
Not many Palestinians, not many Palestinians, right? And certainly, um, I wasn't writing to a Palestinian audience. I was writing to an American left audience. Like I know who my audience is,
for sure.
right?
Okay.
And so I am saying because it's rhetoric. We did talk about that. It's not
Yeah.
only logical conceptual, it's also rhetorical. Everything is always both. It has to be, especially in this environment where everything is terminology. Like there were protesters chasing AOC around, trying to capture her on video, saying, why won't you say it's genocide? Right? Like people think it's like you use a magic word, right? It's like say her name, right?
Right. I remember that. I
And it's
saw a clip
like,
of it. Yeah.
right? And it's like if you think that AOC is not doing enough to protest the Israeli war against the Palestinians, you really think she's not doing enough? A member of Congress, she's not doing enough already? But no, you just want to shame her for what? For what? What is going on here? So,
It's the
I
answer
mean,
to your question. It's the answer to your question earlier of why the squad set themselves up to be taken down by
yes.
the Israel lobby. Well, they set themselves up to be taken down because they are capitulating to uh, the obvious presence of this protest movement, which is like, of course, they're going to have to deal
I
with
mean,
that.
they would have sympathized with this anyway. In other words, nobody's changed their position. I remember Jamal Bowman got into trouble because he voted for the Iron Dome. I think he got expelled from the DSA because he voted for the Iron Dome in Congress. He voted to fund the Iron Dome. And so they were like, we can't have someone like that in the DSA. And I was like, okay. And what he said was it's defensive weapons. It's not offensive weapons. And that's why he voted for it. And now he's being primaried out, even though he voted for funding Israel militarily.
Okay.
Okay. Right. So, you know, if people think that it's like a line that you cross or a position that you take, it's like, well, and so now so Jamal Bowman was denounced by a Palestinian solidarity left, and now he's going to be defended by a Palestinian solidarity left against APAC, right? And it's like, but what is Jamal Bowman actually doing? Is he actually furthering the cause of socialism in the United States, or is he just a Democratic Party politician of a younger generation who has a different style, a different rhetoric, a different set of pet concerns than the older Democrats? Right? In other words, is this just keeping up with what's PC?
Yeah.
In other words, AOC, Jamal Bowman, the squad, aren't they just the younger face of the Democratic Party, but the same basic thing? And, so again, it's like, look, and again, Biden, right? Because people will talk about this in mainstream political discourse. They're like, well, Biden is like going along with this pro-Palestinian sentiment because he thinks that he has to, because actually he's very pro-Israel. In his heart of hearts, he's always been pro-Israel. Now, I watch Fox News, and I can tell you on Fox News, they're saying the exact opposite. They're saying Joe Biden has always been anti-Israel and an anti-Semite. And they go back to like Menachem Begin, Prime Minister of Israel, who Joe Biden was giving a hard time to. And Menachem Begin was like, I'm not one of those weak Jews that shakes at the knees, right? Fuck you, Joe Biden. I'm not going to be talked to that way, right? And whereas Joe Biden is like, I'm an American senator. And am I getting my bang for my buck? Like, we're sending you this money. Are you doing what we want you to do with it? And Menachem Begin's like, no, I'm not going to be told what to do. So the Fox News people are like, see, Biden always had contempt for Israel. He's always been disrespectful. He's always been anti-Israel. He's always only cared about Israel insofar as they did what he wanted them to do. And then they go back further and they're like, oh, he has connections with the Klan-infested Democratic Party of the South, and so of course he used to consort with these racists and these anti-Semites, and so Joe Biden's selling out Israel because he's always been anti-Israel and he's always been an anti-Semite. Who's right and who's wrong? Biden has always been pro-Israel, or he's always been anti-Israel? He's been neither of those. He's been an American politician. He's neither pro-Israel nor anti-Israel. He does only care about Israel insofar as it's in his interest to care about Israel as an American capitalist politician, right? But you would think, Genocide Joe, right? It's like it all hangs on what Joe Biden does or doesn't do,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like it really doesn't. And generally speaking, the American ruling class, they have always said the settlements are illegal. They have always said the only solution is a two-state solution. They've always said this. I guess for a moment, Trump was like, well, the settlements are illegal, but they're not completely illegal. They like tried to fudge that a little bit. But again, that was part of a negotiating strategy in which they were hoping to get a peace deal out of it. And instead they were burned. And so Trump is very pissed off that Netanyahu misled him into thinking that he could negotiate a deal. Whereas no, Netanyahu, I think that what Trump said is he thought that Netanyahu wanted peace. Now he sees Netanyahu only wants war.
Hmm.
Trump. Yeah. So the entire American ruling class is unhappy with the situation, and they're unhappy with the Israeli leadership. So what do the protesters want that the American ruling class is not already trying to do? And shouldn't we be doing something else? Like, in other words, let the ruling class figure out its thing, and they're going to figure it out. They're going to find some way of pressuring Israel to do what they want them to do, and they'll succeed or fail at that.
Well,
Who
that
was the
is,
biggest funder of the Palestinian Authority? Who was the biggest funder of the Palestinians? The United States. The United States and the EU through the United Nations. Of course, the United States is the biggest funder of the Palestinians, not just of Israel, but of the Palestinians.
yeah, I
Why?
did not know that.
Yes, you just have to
I mean,
look this stuff.
it makes sense. Sure,
Yeah.
I could look it up, but also I kind of don't imagine anything I say or do makes any difference on anything.
Well, there's that. Yeah.
It sure looks like I could spend 100 hours trying to figure out the bottom of it, and I wouldn't get there. And so, I mean, I've
There
I've
are just
watched
some basic things,
watched a
right? And
few
you just have to
videos, you know.
yeah. There are some basic things though, and it's not like I mean, look, it's an intractable, horrible, bad situation, and that's what makes people think, what the fuck's going on?
Right?
Because it's so intractable over such a period of time. And so it generates a kind of paranoia. I mean, the left also feeds on a lot of psychological paranoia, which I think is unfortunate. I think that we should have a non-paranoid view of things. We really should. Because it's not good for us. It's not good for our understanding, our perspective. It's not good for our psychology to have a paranoid view of things.
Yeah, I was
So
just
we have
having
to.
a conversation with Daniel Garner from OG Rose yesterday on this channel where he was talking about the conspiratorial sociology as opposed to the sociology of trade-offs, which is
Mm-hmm,
a
mm-hmm.
lot more interesting and mature. I think anyone who wants to look into it could just look into the stream from yesterday. In our last 5 minutes here, I do want to bring it back to something really quick, and that is just to say the other half of what I was saying about the worst thing for Ghazians was who took up their cause. Like it would have been a lot. I mean, if it could have come from somewhere else, I think it could have been a lot better for them. But
Their political fortunes. You mean if, like, I don't know, the Christian evangelicals took
yes,
up the cause of
yeah,
Palestinians?
yeah, that would have. I
Well,
mean, I don't imagine
except
that would happen, but I'm just saying
it could hypothetically happen in some alternate reality. It's not completely out of the question. However, don't
we
give the
do live.
Christian evangelicals more power than they actually have.
No, no, that's why I
Right?
didn't specify where, because
Right.
I'm not saying
Right.
it would be there. Honestly, here's the thing: is like with there are new tendencies in the populist sort of like I don't know, little like world. I don't look too much into it, but I understand like they're not all evangelicals, for instance. And I know that
I mean, look,
the evangelicals
yeah.
are these ones who've kind of like they've got like those Left Behind books, and they believe that the way you read Revelation, you know, if we pull away from Israel, that's the end of
I
everything.
mean, maybe look,
They do believe
at a
that.
very
So
at a basic level of world history, maybe the reestablishment of the state of Israel is the sign of the apocalypse. I was just thinking that this morning, by the way. I was just thinking maybe in the shower or washing dishes. I was like, maybe the crazy Christian evangelicals are right that the reestablishment, the return of the Jews to, the promised land is a sign of the end times. Children, the end times are capitalism, right? In other words, yes, capitalism made possible the reestablishment of the state of Israel, also the need for it, the Holocaust, meaning, insofar as Israel has any justification whatsoever, it's via the Holocaust, and certainly capitalism led to the Holocaust. So, yeah, it is the end times, but guess what? The end times are the capitalist era. That's what we're talking about. Meaning there is something apocalyptic about these kinds of wars. We don't pay attention to all the wars that are going on in the world, by the way. That's
no,
another point.
no,
So we
that
only
is
pay
one of the
attention to
things people.
some,
Yeah, that is one of the things
right?
people do. To
Yeah.
finish that thought though, to finish that thought for people who are wondering why I wanted to stay on this for so long, I wanted to say that the perspective you bring with your piece, the reason I do think it is refreshing, even though like I think it's like a thought experiment is kind of what it is.
It is, of course it is.
But the reason I find it refreshing is because everyone else in the world is looking to you, if you are that Palestinian teenager, and basically saying, stand up for yourself, little guy. And in my opinion, it's like the worst thing you could tell that person. It's sure, of course, stand up for yourself. But also, like
Yeah.
if you listen to Finkelstein, if you and I love to,
Yeah.
He's a great
Yeah.
orator, and he's at least that. He's basically just being like, hey, you're in a hopeless situation, but just you know what?
Die nobly.
Die nobly. My heart is like, I support you. And it's just like, dude, we basically have the most privileged people in the world, all over the world, telling the people who are the least privileged, yes, keep it up, guys. And it's just like,
keep sacrificing yourself for the noble cause. And it's like, but this is just not going the way people think it's going.
yeah,
It just
yeah.
isn't. And, in other words, one has to, would it be right for the Native Americans to start launching terrorist attacks from the reservation? Would they be justified? I mean, I don't know. Would it be a good idea? No, it wouldn't be a good idea. Of course, the left would support it because they love that kind of shit, I guess. Like it's like, but no, if I'm a Native American on the reservation or a Native American off the reservation, do I want to see a war between the United States and the Native Americans? Who's going to win? It's like, it's like, well, hundreds of years of genocide, aren't they justified in launching a terrorist attack against white settler colonialist society? To accomplish what? Right? To accomplish the final extermination of the Native Americans? But again, that's not what's going to happen. That's not what's happening. That's not even what would happen if that happened now. If a asymmetrical warfare was launched from the reservation, the United States would not try to genocide the Native Americans.
No, but I think it is what these kinds of leftists you've been talking about would like to see. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
and it's like, children, that is fascist imagination.
Yeah.
It really is. Let's just cut to the chase. This is a fascist imagination.
Okay, so you take the side of Adorno in the back and forth between him and Marcuse when they were when Adorno was like, this shit's left fascism, and Marcuse was like, how dare you say that? There's no such thing. And Adorno was like, actually, yeah, there is.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do. I mean, the point is, Marcuse and Adorno agreed more than they disagreed on that. Meaning, of course, Marcuse said there are counter-revolutionary and revolutionary tendencies bound up in the student movement or whatever. And it's like, what we were talking about earlier, though, the subjective and the objective. And
Okay.
I think that there's this idea that, like, yes, Hamas might be subjectively reactionary, but objectively, what they're doing is progressive or something. And it's like, no, objectively, they're just contributing to the turnover of capital. I think that I put it, in my first essay on Israel-Palestine. Gaza will be rebuilt by the workers of the world, Palestinian and otherwise. Gaza
Yeah.
will be rebuilt by the workers of the world, Palestinian and otherwise. That's the future. The future is not genocide.
So to close this out, anything else you want to like bring it back around to in terms of Rockhill, Midwestern Marxist, and your intro to Marxism course that you'll be teaching and all of this shit? Like, is there anything that ties this all up? I would like to bring you back to talk more about Milton Friedman later and more about Trump
Uh-huh.
and Biden later, because we didn't
Uh-huh.
really get it. We ended up
It's
spending,
time for Trump and Biden.
we spent the whole time on this, which is good,
We did.
but I just want to say, like, the Rockhill Midwestern Marxist approach, as far as I understand it, they've got stiffies for Parenti, and they see the world that way. What is it you're
It's
gonna?
imperialism, anti-imperialism. That's the worldview.
Yeah, and
And
so,
Platypus started out, I should say. So I got roped back into the left by my students around the anti-war movement during the War on Terror. And there the issue was imperialism, anti-imperialism, anti-US imperialism. And the very
sure,
first event that Platypus held was a forum on imperialism, what is it, and should we be against it? Right? And again, um, I'll just say anti-imperialism has a long history in the United States, and it's a good history. However, it's a mixed history. So William Jennings Bryan, populist, People's Party, anti-imperialist, became a Democrat, became Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson as an anti-imperialist. Still led us into World War One. So that anti-imperialism, the Anti-Imperialist League, yeah, it was good people. But anti-imperialism, I'll just go back to Eugene Debs. He said socialists have a different opposition to imperialism than the Democratic Party does. Meaning there is a petty bourgeois anti-imperialism that sees big capital as the enemy and is happy to oppose big capital on any terms. And that's not the Marxist approach. The Marxist approach is not to side with small capital against big capital, right? Not to subordinate the working class to small capital. And that's what we're talking about here. Anti-imperialism is a petty bourgeois radicalism. It's a petty bourgeois democratic anti-capitalism. But that is not proletarian socialism. That's not actually going to overcome capitalism. What that does is it reshuffles or reconfigures capitalism. It reshuffles the national settlements of capitalism, but it reconstitutes capitalism. And it's a reactionary, like not reactive, but reactionary. It's a conservative. It's opposition to capitalism. In other words, it wants to tear down big capital. It wants to break up monopoly capital. It wants to break up the trusts. It opposes finance capital. That's not the point. From a Marxist perspective, that is not the point. The point is that finance capital, monopoly capital, is the prelude to socialism. So you don't want to undo that. you want the working class to take that over. Petty bourgeois radicals want to tear down big capital, right? So that's why they're on the side of the Palestinians against the Israelis, because they see the Israelis as representing imperialism, big capital, and they see Palestinian nationalism as like small capital against big capital. It's the little man against the big man. That's not the Marxist approach. That is not the Marxist approach. It's not the proletarian socialist approach. It is not. Because, there used to be an understanding against the working class, small capital and big capital will align themselves, right? Now, if there is no working class, then of course the conflict in capitalism is between big capital and small capital.
Don't you
Between the
think?
people who are
Don't
top-
don't you? See, I feel like this is you're kind of forcing the situation into this Marxist perspective. But bear with me for
But
a
in
second.
reality, that's
but
what
bear
it
with me.
is.
But bear with me just for a sec. I don't. I just don't see that from anybody. Like people just don't like little kids getting blown to pieces constantly, and so they're just saying, "I don't like this."
But
Like
why do they think it's happening? In other words,
don't-
if we're going to admit Marxism at all into the mix, if we're going to admit the question of capitalism to the mix, if we're not, then we're just at the level of genocide and slavery and extermination and all that good stuff. Okay, but if we're going to start to talk about capitalism at all, then people will say Israel represents Wall Street in the Middle East. It is the exploitation, domination, oppression of people by finance capital, and Israel is the agent of finance capital. Meaning it's the beachhead of American imperialist subjugation of the Middle East. And that's why any resistance to that is good. It's like, well, resistance in the name of what? If it's resistance in the level at the level of we should be the capitalists in the Middle East and not the Jews or something, like, in terms of Israel-Palestine, it should be Muslims running capitalism, not Jews. Because that's what it boils down to. In other words, what does Hamas want? Hamas wants Islamic capitalism in Palestine. That's what they ultimately want. So that's the issue, anti-imperialism. So in the United States, you look at the ruling parties, you look at big capital, you look at the global order in which the US plays a prominent role, and you say, okay, these people are my enemy. And then you're happy to see someone opposing them. Because that's the way it's understood. It's understood as the people of Gaza are standing up against the rotten order of the world. Right? Israel versus Palestine is a microcosm of US imperialism over the people of the world. And so, people will say this. I've heard student protesters say this, that the struggles of the world are manifesting in Palestine.
Sure.
That
Sure.
Palestine's in the vanguard of the global struggle against white settler colonialism, racist capitalism. Capitalism will get in there, but it'll be last. It'll be like
I have seen
right?
some variants of this. Sure. Yeah.
Right? And I'm like, but you're conceiving of it all wrong. Meaning that's not capitalism. That's something else. In other words, they don't see things in terms of transforming capitalism into socialism. They're just thinking of who's on the top and who's on the bottom of capitalism.
Yeah, it's this kind of this progress. It's like this. It is this. A lot of the time, leftism is informed not so much by theory, but the basic sort of pre thought out theory that's just like, I take the side of underdogs. End of story. Right? Like, I'm against bullying.
It's a very bourgeois perspective. It's a quaint. It's not an unhealthy perspective. It's a healthy perspective, but it just ain't gonna work out that way. It's just not. Okay, so Hamas, they're billionaires. The leadership of Hamas are billionaires. They have more money than Donald Trump. What does that mean? It means they own real estate. Where do they own real estate? In Turkey, in the Gulf states. They are real estate moguls. They have billions of dollars that they've skimmed off of all the humanitarian aid that has gone to Gaza and the West Bank, right? They have taken the money out. They've put it into some tunnel construction and some weapons. But the vast majority of the money they've just taken out, and they have it in their Panama Papers bank accounts, and they have it in real estate in Istanbul and in the Gulf states. They have billions. They have more money than Donald Trump. They have more liquid assets than Donald Trump. Okay, so what they want is to be the ruling class of a Muslim Arab Palestine. That's what they are. That's what they want to be. That's what they're setting themselves up to be. And it's a long-term struggle. And in the meantime, they are capitalists. They are real estate owners, real estate developers, landlords. They're blood-sucking rent. They are capitalists. And they're gangsters. They do what all capitalists do. They accomplish things with money, and when that doesn't work, with force. Our hope can't be pinned to those people. They have no interest in overthrowing the global capitalist order whatsoever. Hamas has no interest in that at all. Zero.
So
They are our enemy.
Jack said, so bourgeois infighting, that's all you see this as, is bourgeois
Yes,
infighting?
absolutely, completely, totally. And that goes to all levels of society. So there's a Netflix documentary on Gaza from before this whole mess now, this whole complete catastrophe. And you'll see it's not a prison or a concentration camp. People were living there. And it's basically controlled by street gangs. And there are three. And the dominant street gang is Hamas, meaning it's pickup trucks with teenage kids with guns, right? And then, so they're the green. Then there's Islamic Jihad. They have black bandanas instead of green bandanas, but otherwise it's the exact same thing. And then the left, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, they're just the kids with the red bandanas. And there were rich people in Gaza. There were rich people. There were property owning rich people, business people, right? There were rich and poor people. And the gangs mediate the rich people's control over the poor people. It's capitalism. It just is capitalism. That's what it is. It's just miserable poor people's capitalism, which means gangster capitalism, which is what this is over here too. Like, you just peel back the layer a little bit. That's all that it is. Right? But there it's just openly what it is. Yeah, so yeah, it's intra-bourgeois, but what do people think bourgeois means? Bourgeois means property owning. It means who controls resources, who's the boss, who's the employer, who's the exploiter. There are Palestinians who exploit other Palestinians. There's a Palestinian bourgeoisie. Hamas is part of it. It's as simple as that. There are enemies.
I want to end it on that point.
Mm-hmm.
They're the enemies to the Palestinian workers. I want to end it on that point, and I just want to put it out there to everybody. I want you all to know that I am not a leftist. I am a person who runs an educational institute and publishing platform where I want to center learning for people who are trying to figure things out for themselves. And for that purpose, identity on my part matters very little, and it should matter very little. It should matter a lot more, in my opinion, for my role, that I make the space for certain kinds of conversations. But I don't just platform whatever conversation. I try to work with the people who I feel like I'm learning from, or they provoke something in me in my learning process. And my hope is that you all get something out of that as well. And to that end, we have these contradiction conversations, which are not debates because there's a side that wins in a debate. A contradiction conversation, the only winner is the person who doesn't really have a position, who's trying to figure things out, and they want to see the two sides, whatever's in the limelight at the moment, justify themselves vis-a-vis the other, in the other's presence, right? And that's what we did with McGowan and Cutrone. We had them on a couple months ago, month and a half ago, and now that conversation, that episode is going to premiere tomorrow. It'll also be available on the podcast. But that's not why I'm talking about this. That's an example of a contradiction. It's less heated and gets into fewer contradictions than a lot of these contradiction conversations might. We also call these converdictions. It's a bit of a neologism. But the reason I bring up contradiction on our way out here is because people will often say that I don't go hard enough on my guests or whatever. And I think that those are usually people who spend too much time online and they don't get out much and go between different kinds of social situations.
I'm also not trying to convince anyone of anything. I should just say, I'm raising things just for people to think about. Like, just consider. You might end up in the same position that you have at the outset, but maybe in a stronger way. I don't know. Just understand.
I'm not trying to defend. I'm not trying to defend having you on or platforming you in any. Right. I would never try to talk to people who would even where that's even on the table. My point is simply this, everybody. My goal is to understand Chris's position, and then eventually, hopefully someday, host a contradiction conversation with somebody who maybe Finkelstein, maybe Gabriel Rockhill, maybe Michael Parenti, maybe, and he was here in the chat. I think he's finally caught up. He's been catching up the whole stream. The Swolitariat and I go way back. I would love to host a conversation between the two of you, but he disagrees on various aspects, whatever. The point is that I learn through those kinds of conversations, and I'm not going to go do all the reading myself. I want to see people who do it justify themselves in the presence of the other, and then maybe that'll give me some direction to go in on my own. But the reason that it hasn't happened yet with Finkelstein and Cutrone is because Finkelstein is in the stratosphere. He's not reachable anymore. He was reachable when I was working with him in September, and we were able to have conversations. But since then,
he's too much in demand. He's in demand.
Very in demand. Yeah, he's got bigger people to talk to right now. So, Rockhill's probably a lot more doable. I'd be down. And since we have brought up his name a lot at this point, I'd just say hi, man. Yeah, we'd be down. Just hit me up. But with that said, I want everyone in the comment section in the future on this video and in the podcast, just let us know what kind of conversation you would like to see here. Maybe we'll make it happen. And with that, anything you'd like to add as we close out here?
No, other than, I'm trying to, my point here is not really about the issues of the day, but more about long-term struggle for socialism and long-term perhaps usefulness of Marxism in that struggle for socialism. So I will put a plug in for the new book, Marxism and Politics. If you want to know where I'm coming from theoretically, that's where you should go. And I think that it does make sense ultimately. And I think that my perspective on something like Israel-Palestine is from a viewpoint on the place of capitalism in history, the long-term trajectory of history. And that's really the issue for me. Like, when we place things in that perspective, how do they look? So if you're interested at all in that, that's what I really have to offer. And that's what I'll be coming back with Theory Underground in the fall to talk about Marxism on that point.
All right. Looking forward to it. Also, everybody, make sure, seriously, to like this video. I know it's so stupid. It's so annoying. I hate to say it. But I do want everyone to realize that this course is coming up. That's the main thing. And also, if people think a little bit deeper about telling people in a desperate, horrible situation to do something that goes against their own interests, there might be some benefit to that as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.
Cool.
Take care. Thanks, Chris.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of the bullshit and just want to get down to it. Big ideas, rigorous thinking, and ultimately liberation from necessity.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation: theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. Besides a commitment to publishing certain underground theorists and popularizing certain fundamental concepts, we have toured the United States and are touring Europe to promote our ideas, courses, and publications. You've been reading Underground Theory.
Amazing book. I'm a publisher and an editor. I run a review of books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture this scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working-class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Time Energy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Žižek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first, obviously, I have to get freed myself, so the two of us are able to do this because, you know, as Mikey said, build it and they will come. Well, I tried and I built a website and platform. I had my own app and everything, but it's been really buggy and it's more than one person can handle, and that's, you know what, a really good lesson for me. And so for now, what we're doing is moving it to a temporary intermediary platform until we are able to get some more serious funding. And ultimately, we want to be in a place like this, a real brick and mortar digital nomadic mecca where people can come from all over the world. But also, the app was really expensive, and so by quitting it, I am now able to save a lot of money, and with the help of my patrons and the students at Theory Underground, especially the monthly subscribers, I am officially able to quit Amazon and do Theory Underground full time. So thank you so much, everybody. This is one huge step forward. With that said, several subscribers did not migrate from the now defunct app to the new setup, and I'm guaranteed to lose people over time. So please, if you want to get involved, become a subscriber. If you're not even sure what this is all about but are just curious, then I've added tier 0 and tier 1 for very basic kinds of access to what we are doing behind the scenes. If you don't have any time or energy to get involved, but you do have some money to help support this project from afar, then please check out the Patreon. My patrons over at Patreon make the podcast and public YouTube possible. Thank you. As for once-in-a-lifetime events, check out the new poster for the American Idiots Theory Underground European Book Tour. Paris, Brussels, Berlin, Vienna, Linz, Krakow, Glasgow, London, and Oxford from April 27th to May 25th, 2024. 2 events are already fully booked out. Save a seat at an event by getting in contact with us ASAP. Finally, the call for proposals to our conference in Mexico.
What's up, everybody? TUCon 2024 update here. It's not happening in Mexico anymore, but it is still happening on October 24th through the 27th.
The change was made because a lot of the people that wanted to attend and that were expected to attend said they could probably afford to travel if they had more time advance notice. So save up for June 2025.
If you have to choose, right? Because this one that is happening this year is happening physically in Boise, Idaho, because we have a lot of collaborators and fellow travelers and co-instructors there. But you can attend virtually for this one. You won't be able to attend virtually next year. So yeah, if you have to choose, attend physically in 2025. The call for proposals already happened. The writing workshop for proposals already happened. You can still get the links to both of those. Just shoot us a message and ask for those links. We'll get you those. And the form goes live on June 1st, and the deadline is June 15th. So if you're attending physically, let me know ASAP.
Get in on it.
All right. Finally, last little thing here is to say thank you so much to my patrons over at Patreon. The Patreon is for people who are too busy to be students or subscribers at Theory Underground, but who want to see more of this free content on the podcast and YouTube channel for Theory Underground. You are the ones who see something of value in the free content being made available here, and you want to see more of it. Your patron pledges at Patreon are a real motivator for me. So thank you so much, especially to Marilyn Lawrence, Bert Vanderkar, Carl Vanderlip, Nikolai, Sakil, Zoxandra, Darian, Max, Al, Alagiri, Ben, as well as several others, including Core Atlantic, Louis, Matt Payne, Neil, Simon, and Yiz.